Yesterday, aliens visited my town. By visited, I really mean invaded. Stealthily, of course, but an invasion nonetheless. You aren't really a visitor when your primary purpose is to abduct and experiment upon the land's people, even if you plan to return them to their homes, without them ever knowing what had happened. I was one such abductee, but unlike the others, I actually woke up while still aboard the alien ship. I don't know much about them, couldn't tell you from what planet or even what galaxy they hail, nor can I offer any accurate evaluation of their technological superiority. I can only say that their tech is superior to our own. The jury is still out in regards to their cultural sophistication. I'm not sure whether to classify them as connoisseurs of high cosmic art, or barbarians who glorify scenes of cataclysmic violence. On their ships, throughout every room I went into, were grand depictions of some momentous event, a battle or massacre in which people of their kind fought some other, hideously alien species. Neither were very similar in morphology to humans, but my abductors at least seemed to have been born of the same general idea that intelligent beings required consistent physical forms. The other species within the extra-mundane displays of art were an abominable, shifting composite of aquatic and plant life. They appeared to fight with their various tendrils and tentacles, whereas the abducting species utilized what appear to be lightning-spitting tridents. The aliens' obsession with this event led me to believe that a similar fate awaited Earth, that once they had a complete knowledge of our physiology, they'd begin a campaign of planetary genocide that would leave our cities as nothing more than mile-spanning piles of smoldering rubble. Whether or not this catastrophic invasion will come to pass is not immediately relevant to my story, but worth mentioning nonetheless. I woke in the midst of the aliens probing me, not inappropriately, while chattering to each other in their weird, ululating tone. Whatever sleep-inducing agent they had used had already worn off. From what I gathered by their argumentative tones and gestures, there had been an issue with their unseen method of transportation, causing a delay in my abduction. Luckily, as I learned from glances at the other abductees suspended throughout the room by some anti-gravitational force, their tranquilizing agent didn't cause the patient's eyes to close for whatever reason. To them, I appeared to be sleeping as comfortably as the other humans, even as I stared into their 6 heavy-lidded eyes. They patted me, lifted parts of me, even tickled sensitive areas, thank you, anesthetic while charting and logging the information they sought. Afterwards, I was taken away from the brightly lit reception room and eventually placed within a small, curved-walled chamber, illuminated dimly by a single tube-like light affixed to the ceiling. The light emitted by the tube was a somber red, reminiscent of a dying Christmas light. I was laid into a rather comfortable chair, without restraint. I was still somewhat limp from the drugs, but could have moved with coordination if I had wanted to. But to keep up the perception that I was still under the sedative effects, I allowed my body to sag and flop about. The 2 workers who had carried me into the chamber tried to sit me in an upright position, but I kept intentionally falling over. I would have milked the moment all day, perhaps given them the impression that human bones were far more malleable than they might have thought if I hadn't been allowed to completely fall out of the chair. In an alien grunt of frustration, they tucked me under the seat like kicking a shirt under the bed when you're too lazy to bend down and pick it up. The door to the chamber was then shut and sealed, and the light changed from the moody crimson to a soft, eerily calming green. I heard other doors in other nearby chambers also shut and seal. There was no window in the chamber's door. Everything was green-tinted metal. Despite the awkward position I was in, I wasn't exactly uncomfortable, and remained in that way until I felt that I had regained total control of my limbs. Once the effects of the drugs had worn off and full dexterity had returned to me, I started to climb out from my position beneath the chair, but before I could fully do so, a sound issued from unseen speakers, a sort of electronic buzzing that swirled throughout the small chamber. Disconcerted by the noise, I froze until it rose to a pitch that forced me to duck back under the seat and cover my ears. An instant later, the chamber flashed white, blinding me. It was as if I had stared at the sun for a full minute, or had gazed out onto a snow-blasted field after being locked in darkness for hours. For several moments, I saw nothing but white, until the vague outlines of the chamber's smooth and curved surfaces came into view. A few more moments later, and I had mostly regained my sight, although the buzzing in my ears hadn't yet gone away. One element which had changed, and which was not some lingering result of the blinding light, was the color of the room's illumination. It had resumed the dark red of before, the light no longer the pacifying green. Just after I took notice of the red light's return, the door's lock disengaged, and it came ajar. I heard a similar sound repeated down the corridor, the same sequence happening in the other chambers. I wasn't sure what the purpose of the white flash had been, but whatever it was, the process was now complete. I waited beneath the chair for at least a full minute, expecting the return of my guards. When no one arrived, and no other sounds could be heard, I crawled out from beneath the chair, rose to my feet, and opened the heavy door. Unlike the interior of the chamber, the ship's corridor was bathed in a harsh, yellow-filtered light, which gave the air the impression of being polluted. I walked along the wall in which my chamber had been set, and peered into the 5 other small rooms. Each was just as mine had been, lit by a red light, with their doors now slightly ajar. Since I had been the last to be brought onto the ship, I assumed that other people had already occupied those rooms prior to my placement in mine, although I couldn't guess at where they had gone. Still a bit loopy-headed from the drugs, but in total possession of all physical faculties, I crept along the opposite wall, going down the corridor which branched away from the one which I had originally been brought. The series of chambers along the opposite wall ended, and gave way to a wall spanning observation window, which looked into a medical room of some kind. This room held various machines, terminals, and tables of equipment of purposes I won't even bother trying to guess at. I also saw the splayed, flayed, and filleted bodies of humans sat in steel chairs or piled in gruesome heaps atop large tables. There was an alien physician within the room, clad in a smock of some thin, silvery material. It was using a multi-bladed saw to sever portions of limbs from the stack of bodies. Despite the resultant sprays of blood clearly being splashed onto the smock, it bore no stains, the crimson apparently absorbed into the fabric. I have never had a tolerance for gruesomeness, so I ducked below the window and crouch-walked beneath its vantage, not wanting to see another second of the butchery. I came to an intersection in the corridor. The rightward branch led down to the entrance of the aforementioned medical room, and the doors of other, unknown rooms were also present therein. To the left, the corridor terminated in a single door a few feet down with no others lining the sides. I took this path, not wanting to be caught by an alien who was so casually, mercilessly mutilating human beings. All of the doors I had seen, including the one to my chamber, were all the same. A complex locking mechanism affixed to their tops sealed them shut, although the one before me had been left ajar, intentionally or not. I had opened it, and left the yellow haze of the corridor. I stepped into a small, low-ceiling area, presumably meant for storage, judging by the various metal crates and canisters neatly placed around the room. The light in this room fairly normal, a soft white. It was unclear why the ceiling of this room came down so low, considering the alien seemed to be of an average height much taller than men. I had to stoop as I went deeper in. The supplies were all labeled, although I lacked the requisite xenolinguistic knowledge to identify them. Within one small metal crate, which had been placed on sort of podium in the back of the room, was a sphere about the size of a tennis ball. It was cold, smooth, and entirely black. It reflected no light, and I couldn't tell if it was a solid piece of some glass-like material or if it held something within. Scanning the room, I found other pedestals on which other spheres, also black, had been placed. Since there seemed to be no shortage of the strange objects, I figured one wouldn't be missed. I pocketed the orb nearest to me and quickly left the room, as my back had grown tired of hunched posture. The terror and sense of vulnerability which had entered my heart at the sight of the medical atrocities only deepened with the discovery of the orb. There seemed to be some sinister significance to it, being placed on what was clearly meant to be an altar. An altar in the room where the Titan-hided aliens would be forced to crawl on their knees to retrieve it. I started to think there was some religious element to the orb, that they regarded it with some dark reverence. Still refusing to venture down the other side towards the entrance into the medical room, I made my way back to the area with the chambers and backtracked from there to the room in which I had first arrived on the ship. I was on the verge of mental and physical exhaustion. I was suddenly afflicted with a feeling of lethargy, which I instantly attributed to the frequent change in lighting, for some reason suspecting that the colors denoted certain atmospheric conditions. The waiting room was empty, save for the bodies which floated in suspended animation like pillars of flesh around the room. I recognized none of these humans, and couldn't immediately discern the purpose for them remaining in the room when all others had been taken elsewhere. But, if I'm being honest, I didn't really care. I just wanted to go home. There were no doors in this room beyond the one through which I had just passed, and aside from a few metallic cabinets, terminals, and movable tables, the room was bare. A large terminal sat against one wall, with a multi-screen display that relayed images from a camera feed. The controls for the machine were incomprehensible, so I did the only thing I could do. About 45 seconds of button mashing later, the display began showing a recorded image. The footage showed the interior of the holding chambers. The feeds from all 6 rooms played simultaneously. In the first 5 rooms, people sat unconscious within chairs. In the 6th, I watched as my frustrated caretakers nudged me under my seat with their feet and depart thereafter. Moments later, the arrival of the white flash that had nearly blinded me. In the first 5 rooms, the tranquilized occupants had been instantly vaporized, leaving not even a speck of ash upon the untouched seats. In mine, I had survived the disintegration, being underneath the chair. The source of the light-borne destruction was not obvious. Luckily, it had only been directed at the chair, and not flooded throughout the entirety of the room, if such a thing were even possible. The aliens who had been ordered to dispose of me, being the clearly lazy workers they are, had probably planned on returning later and finishing me off by some other means. To them, I was no danger or cause of worry, due to the appearance of my unconsciousness. I mashed a few more buttons, and after the display shifted between images of unfathomable alien conduct, it finally returned to the live footage of that same area, and, as luck or providence would have it, I saw the confirmation of my suspicions. The alien duo had returned, carrying some sort of device which, if I were to intuit its purpose based on its design, they planned to use to bolt my body to the chair. My heart rate increased exponentially as I realized they'd soon know that I had escaped. Once they found out, the alarm would be raised, and I'd have a ship of terrifying extrasolar giants searching for me. I doubted they'd still afford me an instant, seemingly painless death, but things were going in my favor that night. The aliens, who had expected to howl or screech in surprise, merely raised their forelimbs upon seeing the empty room. Despite our differences in anatomy, it was pretty clear that this was their equivalent of shoulder shrugging. They clearly assumed that the room's vacancy meant that I had fallen prey to the light's annihilating effects. They immediately walked away, swinging the 2-handled tool casually between them. With the immediate worry of discovery assuaged, I again peered around the room, hoping to find something that could help me get off the ship. The room was rather uninteresting for a vessel belonging to an advanced alien civilization, very functional with not much extraterrestrial flair. Perplexed, I removed the black sphere from my pocket and gazed into it, hoping to glean some kind of meaning from its dull surface. It wasn't heavy, about the weight of an apple, but even with a firm grip, I sensed that it would be impossible for me to crush the thing. I squeezed it anyway, just to physically exert myself and relieve some of the stress. This elicited a change in the orb. Like the various lights of the ship, it changed in color, now becoming a solid blue. Nothing else accompanied this charge, so after a few moments, I squeezed it again. It again became black, without design or embellishment. A third squeeze brought another change in color, this time red. I had applied more pressure, and after further experimentation, I found out that pressure determined color. It would always reset to black after changing colors. Harder squeezes resulted in warmer colors. Squeezing at my absolute hardest turned it a bright yellow, comparable to the urine-like tint of the corridor. The arrival of the yellow surface also elicited a change in the room. The bodies that floated around the room were suddenly enclosed within barely perceptible force fields of a color not dissimilar to the sphere I held. I stood pretty much in the center of the room, equidistant from the bodies that encircled it. Upon approaching one of these bodies, the orb began vibrating. When I was near to a body to be able to touch it, the orb's yellow flashed intensely, and the body disappeared. I at first thought that I had just murdered a human being, using the same vaporizing technology employed by the disposal chambers. However, a flashing light on the terminal beneath the body showed that an object, which had once been on the ship, was now somewhere else. The display showing various blueprints, map layouts, and tracked objects in a dizzying array of subscreens. I had not unintentionally murdered someone. I had, if I read the displays correctly, sent them back to the surface of the planet. Realizing the responsibility I now had to my subdued companions, I went around the room and teleported the rest of them back to the surface. The displays beneath the terminals all seemed to show slightly different coordinates, so I hoped that I was sending everyone back to their respective homes. Once the last had gone, I quickly decided to perform the same kindness for myself. I had no idea how to suspend myself in mid-air as the others had been, but didn't feel that it would be necessary. The enveloping field of gold extended down to the floor of the room. I stepped into one at random, and the sphere vibrated intensely as my body painlessly passed through the golden shimmer. I wasn't sure if there would be any adverse effects of the ball entering the field, but decided to take the risk anyway. Before the full object had passed through, my vision went white, and I felt a sudden sensation of disembodiment. When the light cleared, I was back in my room, standing atop my bed. The sphere was still in my hand, although it again reverted to its black color. I quickly placed it beneath my bed, hoping that the aliens were not capable of tracking the object, even though they had kept track of the transported humans. I crept outside and peered up into the night-blackened sky. Among the clouds, no more than a dim, dark speck was what I believed to be the alien ship. I sat there, crouched on my porch with a brick in my hand, waiting for any signs or physical sensations that the aliens were attempting to retake me. 10 or 15 minutes passed before I became extremely drowsy and nodded off. A breeze blowing into my face woke me up, and I quickly returned my gaze to the stars. The ship, or what I thought was the ship, was no longer in the sky. After waiting for around 20 more minutes, I decided they had either left or had receded into the full coverage of the clouds. When I returned to my room and saw what was going on therein, I screamed like a jump-scared idiot. The black sphere was floating above my bed, albeit unsteadily. It rose and fell, as if drawn upwards by some weak magnetism. I watched first in horror, then in confusion, and finally in boredom. The force acting upon it was plainly of insufficient strength to draw it higher than a few feet. Feeling emboldened by this, I reached for the sphere. I was able to snatch it away with ease, and felt only a tickling sensation in the space where it had been suspended. Once in my hand, it ceased to move. I didn't dare squeeze it, but I didn't for the moment fear any further influence. I would have gone right to bed, instilled with courage or apathy by my exhaustion if the following event hadn't happened. A thin piece of metal the general size of a tablet suddenly appeared on my pillow. It had manifested instantly and shimmered faintly with the same golden light that had accompanied my transportation back to Earth. The tablet's surface was smooth, featureless, but upon picking up to examine it more closely, words began to appear. They trailed along the surface like a message being typed across a screen, until the front of the tablet was fully covered. The message was in English, and was obviously directed at me. I managed to read it 3 times, rendered speechless by its contents, before the words faded away. The tablet remained, although its metallic sheen gradually dimmed to a lifeless gray. The message, which I've committed to memory, read, "You dirty little thief, you stupid 2-armed troublemaker. Do you know how much of the ship's energy you expended in your little rescue operation? This isn't some Galaxy-class vessel with near-limitless supplies of fuel, no. You exhausted 3/4 of our reserves when you transported those other people and yourself back to the surface. I was gonna let them go eventually, when a refueling ship passed by the solar system. That's why they hadn't been blasted or turned into lunch. We don't kill everyone we abduct, you idiot. We don't have operational budget to cover up a town's worthy of missing people. Next time, just ask politely to be set free, okay? Don't go around stealing things and turning on shit. You don't see me landing down there, snatching car keys and siphoning gas, do you? No, because I'm not uncivilized. We barely have enough energy to get home. Don't break the ball while we're gone. I'll be back for it in a decade or two.